Hi everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwind Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at the email I am putting into the chat box. And now I would just like to give our wonderful presenter the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Betuwashte. In the Lakota language, that is good day, and I'm hoping that all of you are having a very good day today amidst the public health crisis that we're having. I understand and realize that many people are struggling right now, and I really appreciate the time that you've taken to participate today. And I am going to be talking about using culture to respond to children who have experiences of trauma. And I am very honored to have been invited to share what little I know and the experience that I have with this from a culturally based perspective. My name is Sheena Ikikchumi, Takes the Robe Woman. I am Ethleen Ironcloud Two Dogs in the English language. I am seeing that I cannot hear the speaker.
Yeah, so
Can you
I
hear
think
me
it's
now?
just a little quiet.
Can you hear me now? Hello? Hello?
Alright, it seems like they can hear you better.
Okay. Again, good afternoon, good day. I'm Betuwashte in the Lakota language. That is good day to everybody. And I am Sheena Ikikchumi, Takes the Robe Woman. I am Lakota, Oglala Lakota. To be more specific, I'm enrolled at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and I also have Crow ancestry. And my English name is Ethleen Ironcloud Two Dogs from Porcupine, South Dakota. And I am very honored to have been invited to share what little I know regarding using culture to respond to children who have experiences of trauma. I've been doing this work for many, many years, and I've been doing the work alongside my husband, Muya Money, Mr. Richard Two Dogs, who is a traditional healer in our community. And my role in helping with people that do need healing and with trauma, then I step in to help the children, the girls, and the women. So my experience is based on that, and I'm very blessed to have been a part of this work. Despite the difficulty, despite the sensitivity, despite the seeing people, especially children, suffer with trauma, and I'm so grateful to the Creator for our ways, our traditional healing life ways. So we're going to be talking about that today. And again, I'm very honored to be here, and I appreciate Redwind Consulting Technical and Assistance Center asking me to do this. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be examining trauma, and we're going to be looking at how to provide services and supports that lessen the trauma impact from a Lakota culturally specific approach. And the reason I say that is because there's many, many tribes out there, and there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. as far as responding to trauma from a cultural approach. There is, this is just an example, and it's from my experience, and that's all I can speak about. It's not prescriptive. It's not, a how-to by any means. So I would just like to really highlight that, that this is a Lakota cultural reference and not a, well, you need to do this, to respond to trauma. Each one of you that are participating in this presentation have strengths, teachings, cultural teachings, skills, talents, experience, education, and I know that I would learn from you all also. So I just really would like to make that comment that a lot of times whenever we hear about practices, then there may be an assumption or maybe even a message that, that the cultural lifeways that we're speaking about apply to everybody, and I know that isn't true. So I just like to honor that with cultural humility. We'll be stopping about 45 minutes to take any questions or make mention of any comments that you might have. And so if you would chat them in, as you think of them, then we can come back to those questions. So I need to just let you know that my experience with culturally based responses to trauma, and more specifically healing-informed responses to trauma, is based on an experience that I had back in the 1980s. And I was the director of a substance abuse center, a residential center, for 13 years on my reservation. And it always troubled me that there were young people coming through the program and having so much promise and potential, and then when they left the program, maybe about a month later, 2 months later, they would be back to drinking and using drugs again. And my thought was, well, what are we not doing? And so the only thing I could do was to seek guidance, cultural guidance and spiritual guidance. And whenever I did, the response was, the education is good. The program is doing what it knows to do. And what is not being addressed is the spirit, because everything needs, if there's a wound, then the spirit needs medicine for that wound. And so my thinking was, and because I was trained in the Western modality of treatment and also education, then my thinking was, well, what do I need to do and what steps do I need to take? And kind of having an approach of, well, tell me what to do and I will do it. But what I realized was that it had to also include self-examination, self-discovery, and that I had to do some healing on my own also. So the guidance that was given was have the young people write down what they've never shared with anybody, and then have them burn it at the fire at the inipi. In our language, that is a purification ceremony, a renewal ceremony that's done and commonly called today at the sweat lodge, but we don't call it a sweat lodge, we call it a purification lodge. And have them burn it at the fire there at the purification lodge ceremony, and then when they come out of the inipi, the purification ceremony, then have them wipe off with sage. So once we started doing that, we started seeing great results, to put it in research terms, because the young people reported feeling renewed, refreshed, felt different, and There was much more extensive guidance after that, which I will not go into today because we don't have the time. But that was the beginning. And one of the things that I realized from that experience was that a lot of our young people and adults and individuals have gone through childhood trauma that has not been addressed in a culturally responsive or appropriate way. So what does that mean? It means that our children and individuals and even elders will carry the spirit of that trauma into all the stages of their life. And unfortunately and tragically, many of our people have died with that trauma, not ever being addressed. So that's an overview of what we're going to be discussing. So if you look at this slide, O'ina Jitopa is the 4 stages of life in the Lakota language. Every individual, females and males, have 7 transitions in their life, but overall, as humans, we go through these 4 stages of life. So, for example, we believe, Lakota people believe, that we come from Nahiata, which is the spirit world. We have a belief that we are meant to be here, that we are sent here, and that each one of us come with abilities, talents, skills, gifts, and that we are here to contribute to the blessings of the world, of the universe. So whenever we come here, we come to our mother's womb, and pre-birth there is cultural and ceremonial and spiritual practices that take place. For example, there's singing to unborn baby. The mother is not exposed to anything negative. The family and extended family look out for the mother and the unborn baby. If you look at the bottom of the slide, there's a Lakota word that is wotakuye, kinship. And this is the foundation of Lakota society. We call it the glue that holds us together. So traditionally and historically, the female relatives would really counsel and give guidance to the young woman whenever she became pregnant. And traditionally and historically, the male relatives' kinship system would give guidance and direction to the father, to the young man that was going to become a father. So there was always the thought that, we have to protect the development of the baby. We have to make sure that everything is done appropriately, peacefully. The mother was counseled to not attend wakes or funerals, because not that wakes and funerals are bad, but because there is very strong emotion there. There could be very strong grief. There could be very, sometimes when people are in grief, they become angry. And even in contemporary times, they could become violent. Sometimes, unfortunately, our families and extended families might have a conflict, and it might be expressed at the wake or funeral. So we want to make sure that we do not expose the unborn baby or even children to anything like that. So the young woman would be counseled to stay away from anything that would put the baby at risk. Whenever the baby was born, the first person to touch the baby and to talk to the baby would be the grandmother. And the grandmother would do a spiritual cleansing of the mouth. She would be the first one to transmit her genetic materials through her touch and the characteristics to the baby. She would pray for baby. She would welcome the baby. She would, say "Takoja Dayahi." In our language, that means grandchild. It is good you are here. She would make a prayer and a path for the baby. She would predict the path. Takoja, grandchild, you're going to be strong. You're going to be a leader, you're going to be kind and generous. So if you could look at those arrows on the slide there, the blue, the red, the yellow, and white, what she is showing the baby is a path to follow, a map. So whenever we go anywhere, we go to a big city like New York, Los Angeles, Denver, we need a map. We need something to tell us how to get, to wherever we're going in a safe way. And this is the same thing. The grandmother was gives the baby the direction and the guidance on where to go. And people might think, well, the infant is, doesn't have the, comprehension or capacity to understand, so why is she doing that? But in our belief, the grandmother is speaking to the spirit of the baby, and we believe that the spirit hears and understands the grandmother speaking. So not too long after birth, then a Lakota name is given, a spirit name, and that gives the baby a cultural identity and also grounds them to this earth. Now, if you look at the red arrow on top underneath the words pre-birth, look how close baby is to the spirit world. Baby can turn around and go back to the spirit world, and that does happen. It happens today it's called sudden infant death syndrome. Sometimes our babies will just return to the spirit world without any kind of health problems or accidents or trauma, and there's no explanation for it. So we want to make sure that there is every prevention measure that we can put in place to ground the baby to earth. And so that first stage of life, you see where it says, the blue arrow where it says pre-birth to age 12 approximately, that stage of life is characterized by safety, security, being loved, being cherished, good food, being nurtured, being nourished, and with the intent of making sure that the baby had every opportunity to grow, to be happy, to be healthy. So when the baby first took their first step, then there would be a celebration. There would be a dinner and acknowledgement and praise for the baby. When the baby spoke their first word, then they would have a dinner, the family, and they would praise the baby. So what is that doing for the baby? That is raising and forming their self-esteem and their confidence. And so it's real important to look at, our cultural lifeways of human development, our cultural beliefs around human development, and what contributes to children becoming healthy adults and healthy elders. In the Lakota worldview, the elder role, if you look at the fourth quadrant there with the white arrow, the elder role includes providing teachings, ensuring social order, ensuring that custom law is followed, and ensuring spiritual order. In order to fulfill that role, there are certain things, certain teachings, and developmental milestones that have to be followed in order to fulfill that role. So this first stage of life is very critical. Now, when the children, when young boys get to the age of around 11, 12, 13, then they have their voice changes from a high-pitched tone to a lower-pitched tone of voice. And what that signals to the male relatives is that now it's time for this young man to make a transition from that first stage of life to the second stage. And it may not be age 12, it may be 11 or 13 or maybe even 10 years old. So the male relatives would take him and they would give him 4 days of teaching, and they would do that traditionally in the O'ini Tipi, the Purification Lodge. So they would talk to him about what it means to be a strong young man. They would talk to him about what it means to um, be generous and kind, and how to interact with their female relatives, and they would lay a path for him. So what they were doing is they were actually giving him another set of directions um, to go further in his life. And this ceremony in the Lakota belief system is called a Wichasha Ihunipi, reaching manhood. It's a rite of passage ceremony. And they would then, on the fifth day, they would take him out and do a ceremonial hunt. And this ceremonial hunt involved understanding and respecting the animal relatives. So, for example, if they were to hunt a buffalo, then they would teach and counsel the young man that this buffalo comes from a family also, and we have to make offerings and ask for the life of this buffalo so that our people can have the meat, and that anything that we use from the buffalo, the hide, the skull, will be used in our ceremonies, and we will honor the buffalo. So it wasn't just going out and killing an animal. It was understanding that this buffalo, the buffalo family, the buffalo nation, were making a sacrifice also. So once they did that, then they would have the young man give the meat to maybe some elders that couldn't hunt, or maybe a sundance ceremony or some type of ceremony was going on, or maybe there was a wake or funeral in the community that they would share the meat with. And what that was teaching him was generosity, kindness, and compassion for others. So once they did that, then they would have a celebration where they would give this young man an eagle feather and acknowledge his accomplishment and praise him. They would sing songs for him. They would have a dinner, a feast, and a giveaway on his behalf. So what is that doing for this young man's self-esteem? You know, in the first stage of life, he was celebrated as a sacred being. You know, he celebrated his first word, his first step, and now he's celebrating an accomplishment of transitioning from being a boy to a young man. So that was very critical for his teachings, you know, about how to navigate that second stage of life, and also the third and fourth stages. Now, when the young girl would have her first monthly purification, 11, 12, 13 years old, whatever age that was, then the female relatives would come together and would say, this girl needs some teachings to help her through her life. So they would have what's called Ishnati Awichaloampi, which is they sing for her that dwells alone. That's the translation. And the reason the singing is in there because, again, it's about the prayers for her future, and singing those prayer songs, but also singing in celebration. And the dwells alone refers to the isolation that we are taught as Lakota females to observe when our body is going through the purification ceremony. A lot of times in the Western society, Western belief system, then the purification time of the month for females is seen as a curse. It's seen as a very negative time, when in the Lakota worldview and in many other indigenous worldviews, it's a sacred time. So being in that sacred time means isolating yourself so that the ceremony can take place peacefully and without interruption. So they would take her into the teepee, and they would have her be in there for as long as her monthly purification time lasted, maybe 4 days. I know of, some young women would be in there for 6 days. So it just depends. And then whenever she was done, they would take her into the Ohini teepee, the purification lodge, pray with her, sing with her, bring her out, wipe her with sage, and then they would take her back into the teepee, and they would dress her in all new clothing. whether it was, like a dress or a shawl, moccasins, everything was new because what, this time represented was also a renewal and a new time. She's transitioning from being a girl to a young woman. And then they would have the ceremony, and it was just the women that have the ceremony inside the teepee. And while she was in the teepee for those 4 to 5 days, and she would be working on, piece of beadwork, and she would be counseled about completing that project, during the time she was in there, because what she was learning was patience, she was learning fortitude, and she was learning, how to handle frustration, because at that young age, then, they would be learning to sew, learning to bead, and a lot of times they would make mistakes. And whenever they would make mistakes, they would be experience frustration, but they would be counseled that that is a part of life, and so, and how you handle frustration and challenges is what you're learning now. So just start over, regardless of, what kind of mistake you made, and just keep going, So they would give them the teachings. The older women would do that for them. Now, once the ceremony was held inside the teepee after she completed her monthly purification time, they would bring her out, and there would be songs sung for her praise, to acknowledge her transition into young womanhood. There would be a feast, and there would be a giveaway. So, again, this really impacts the young person's self-esteem, and also grounds them and reinforces their cultural identity. This is what it means to be a Lakota man or a Lakota woman. And then they would, really stress that it was a lifelong journey to live those teachings and to give those teachings life. Now, whenever they get into the third stage, and that might be 19, 20, 21, there's no specific age. The age 21 at the bottom of the graphic is just a marker, indicator that maybe around that time that they would transition into adulthood, where they established their own family. They would begin the process of passing on the teachings. They would learn about the marriage bundle. They would learn about the wokichunze, which is a sacred vow to put children first whenever they do have children. The tiwahe, the tioshpai, which in the Lakota language is family and extended family, accepts responsibility for the child. So it wasn't just about the young man and young woman, having total responsibility for the child. It was also about, the extended family accepting responsibility to provide every opportunity for the child to, grow healthy, grow strong, so that they can, when they transition into that fourth stage where the white arrow is, then they would be able to fulfill the role of elder, providing teachings, ensuring social order, observing custom law, and ensuring spiritual order. And then someday, maybe 90, 100 years old, maybe even more, then they would calmly, peacefully go back to the spirit world without any sickness, without any trauma or accidents. They would go to sleep and go back. They would transition back to the spirit world. So this is like the ideal way that, Lakota people viewed the stages of life. And this is what historically and traditionally they strive to put into place for individuals for healthy development. Now, we understand that, today we have a lot of challenges. And what we are experiencing today is an interrupted journey. So for, in terms of like the impact, then if you look at the bottom of the slide, it says Wotakuya. The Wotakuya, the kinship system, is weakened in contemporary Lakota society. So what that means is that we might have a young woman, maybe 15, 16 years old, who has already experienced a lot of trauma, who has already experienced violence, maybe even while she's pregnant. Maybe her partner has left, so she's alone. She doesn't have a strong kinship system. In fact, she might have been in foster care. And so whenever she does go to the hospital to have her baby, then there's no grandmother there, to welcome the baby, to pray with the baby. And we will know that the baby still comes from the spirit world, that the baby was sent, here and as a blessing. However, the circumstances might mean that this young woman would be overwhelmed. She would not have adequate parenting skills. She may not have the patience, and if she had experienced trauma and violence while she was pregnant, then Lakota people believe that the baby in the womb also experiences the trauma. So whenever the baby is born, then the baby might be irritable, might be hard to soothe, cry all the time without any kind of observable, medical reasons. So the young woman might get overwhelmed, and she might, abuse the baby. She might hit the baby, maybe holler at the baby. Child welfare, child protective services may step in and take the baby from her. The baby may go into foster care and may be abused there. And this example is using a very stark contrast, from the previous slide, just to drive home a point, is that, a lot of our young people and babies and children have experienced trauma even in the womb. So the interruption to their journey through life, through the 4 stages of life, may have begun pre-birth. And so that first stage of life is characterized maybe by fear, by terror, by insecurity, confusion, maybe by being hungry. It's characterized by abandonment, maybe even sexual abuse. So what we're seeing is a lot of children, maybe at the age of 9, 10, cutting on themselves because their understanding of what they're feeling inside is not at the adult level. And all they know is that they don't feel good, that they don't feel, positive about themselves, that they want to get away from the pain, and it might mean inflicting more pain by cutting on themselves, maybe even by drinking. So when they get to the transition age, the young men, the boys, and the girls, they won't have a transition ceremony. They won't have a rite of passage. They're expected, or maybe not even expected is the word, but they transition into that next stage of life without the teachings. So whenever you don't have the directions, then you wander and you search. And a lot of times the wandering and the searching, means going to maybe negative coping skills like drinking and drug use and cutting on themselves and maybe suicide attempts. So we're seeing a lot of that. As you know, as many of you, if not all of you, know that Native youth have the highest suicide rate in the country. And we're seeing that right around 14, 15 years old, all the way up to 24 years old, So that is very, tragic. And that second stage of life is characterized by a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, and maybe expressing it in ways that they choose or they know how to. For example, the pain might be expressed outwardly. They may be aggressive, angry, violent, rageful, or it might, be expressed inward, depression, isolation, cutting on themselves, shutting down. By the time they reach the third stage, then we see a lot of living on the streets. We see alcoholism, drug addiction. Many of our Native young men and women are in prison. We see, the death of our male relatives between the age of 45 and 50, and the death of our female relatives in the early 50s. So what that means for that fourth stage of life is that there's very few elders to pass on the teachings and to keep social order, to observe custom law, and to keep spiritual order. So what that means, according to the Lakota worldview, is disorder, chaos, and confusion. And so what we're seeing is high rates of child abuse, trauma. We see elder abuse. We see all of these imbalances. And I'm not trying to excuse people's behavior. I'm only offering an opportunity to look at it in a different way as far as explaining behavior. So just think about that. So we also have the aspect of intergenerational strengths and resiliency, and we also have unresolved, the path of intergenerational unresolved trauma. So for example, we might have in the black, sorry, this slide is kind of looking like some of the words are cut off, but in that black circle, then we might see behavior that's aggressive, disrespectful, violent, self-harming, self-harmful of a child or a young person. And then if we look further back into into the generations, we might see a father or a mother that has experienced a lot of trauma, maybe in Vietnam, or maybe we see boarding school trauma. In the yellow circle there, we might see grandparents that have gone through World War II, the trauma from that, the boarding school trauma, and we might see in the green circle there, like in the Lakota people's experience, then we see a lot of trauma from the Wounded Knee massacre. Now, Lakota people believe that everything has a spirit, everything. So the emotions, our words. So we're taught to be very careful about what we say and how we express ourselves. And Lakota people believe good feelings have a spirit, and trauma has a spirit. So if you recall, then many of our ceremonies were outlawed. So the cultural and spiritual responses to trauma were not available to many of our people. So many of our people just carried it, and then it became the spirit of that trauma trickled down to the next generation. So many of our young people are carrying this spirit of intergenerational trauma, and many times it becomes too heavy. And whenever it becomes too heavy, then that's when we see the extreme, acts of violence or self-harm, suicide. And many times, people are saying, well, he or she broke up with his boyfriend or girlfriend, and, that's why he or she, attempted or completed suicide. But that is not the only answer. There is a whole multitude of factors, that come into play there, and some of those may have to do with intergenerational trauma. But we also have to look at the intergenerational strengths and resiliency. This father of this child, what strengths did they have, to endure what they did endure, and also the grandparents, what they endured, the fortitude that they had, is also can trickle down to the next generations as well as the grandparents. So the what happened with Lakota people as far as the 1890 Wounded Knee massacre, where over 300 of our men, women, and children were killed by the U.S. Army on December 29th, 1890, many of those descendants are still carrying that trauma because there has not been a response, a cultural response or opportunity to deal with that trauma in a cultural and spiritual way. So the the Lakota people believe a cultural response to trauma is first and foremost attending to basic needs first. What is, of course, safety, of course, hunger, thirst, and a lot of times, we need to do the kigana. In the Lakota language, wo kigana means to comfort. And if we kigana somebody, then what we're extending is our spirit of comfort. We may not even have to hug them or touch them, because many children and young people are averse to touch because they associate touch with, negative or hurtful touch. So the comfort might be just sitting with them, listening to them, giving them water, giving them food. The other aspect of culturally responding to trauma is, in the Lakota language, is anagopta, which doesn't mean, if in the Lakota English dictionary, then if you looked up anagopta, it would list it as the definition as listen, but what it actually means is come to attention, be alert, record it in your mind, whatever you're hearing, and analyze it. Listen to it with that compassionate spirit and ear, and don't form an opinion right away. Wazilia, smudging and purification. That's the Lakota word for using sage or sweetgrass or cedar to smudge the air, purify the air, purify the spirit. Wocheke, which in the Lakota language may translate to prayer, but it actually means crying for a need, that we acknowledge that we are humans and that we do need spiritual help, so we cry for that need. The Wopakinta is spirit purification. Pakinta in the Lakota language means to wipe something away. Wo is like the collective, and so it's like a collective wiping away of the spiritual residue of trauma, the grief, the loss, and it begins the healing process. And I think anything that we have, any indigenous peoples, it's always about healing and a process. It's never about a cure, and that there's certain things that we have to have in order to be engaged in that healing process. So the Wopakita, the spirit purification, is the individual goes into the purification lodge ceremony, the inipi. After the inipi, an elder or older person, and again, gender appropriate. So if it was a girl, the females would help her. If it was a boy, the males would help them. They wipe the individual off with sage in accordance with the spiritual teaching. And it's not touching their body, it's going around the aura of their body. So again, we have to be very careful about touch. If an elder is not available, the individual can wipe him or herself off with sage. And we have many of our people doing that now that have experienced multiple traumas, that they will go in, and when they come out, they will automatically wipe themselves with sage. Then the belief is that the spiritual residue that's left by the trauma is wiped away. Now, a lot of times people will experience feelings of, like, if they've been sexually abused or if they've been physically abused, they will have feelings of being dirty or contaminated, and that's a reference to the spiritual residue that's left by that abuse. Other cultural teachings that we have according to the Lakota worldview is we have a ceremony that's called Ishtamania Wichaki Chipa Kintapi, which is the wiping of tears ceremony. So whenever a person goes through a loss of a loved one, then after about a year, then they will have another family or the community will have a wiping of tears ceremony for them. Now, this ceremony does not, indicate the end of grieving or even the end of mourning, because those of you that have had had losses in your life understand that it's not easy, um, to let go of your loved one, and it's not easy to recover from, grief. So this wiping of tears ceremony is to acknowledge that loss and to pray with the individual and their family who've had the loss, to feed them, to give them spiritual food, and to pray with them, to sing for them, and even to give them gifts. So this ceremony indicates a strengthening of the spirit, so that the people can have more strength to go through life with the absence, the physical absence of their loved one. We also have the Umpowi Chachbi Chekyapi, praying to the morning star. That's very important to the Lakota people, to acknowledge the stars as relatives and to ask for a good day. We also have the Wagluch Tatapi. What that means is an offering to the spirits, for example, food or tobacco, not the processed tobacco, but the natural tobacco, material, fabric. According to the Lakota worldview, then if we're going to ask for prayers or anything, then we need to, give something back. We need to offer something too. We also have a belief that the Shunkawakan, the horses, have healing powers. So we do have a horse healing ceremony that is done for, people, particularly with those with emotional and mental disturbances or illnesses. So there is, these aren't the only ones, they're just examples. So the encouragement is, this is just an overview of the Lakota cultural response to trauma. But my encouragement would be to look to your respective culture for strengths, tools, strategies to advocate and help children, and relate to the children as relatives, not as clients, cases, students, or numbers. These are our relatives, despite, even if we're not related to them by blood. Explore and change the impact of language used with, for, and about children and their families. For example, saying dysfunctional families, to me, is a disrespect to them because it doesn't acknowledge their strengths as a family. It just identifies them by what they're going through. Special ed kid, that is not appropriate or respectful to that child with special education needs. Or problem child, there's a lot of terms that we use with people that have complex needs, children and families. So I would really encourage us to explore and discuss and change, our language to a more healing-informed terminology. So I said I would stop at in 45 minutes, and I think I went over a little bit, but I would like to acknowledge any questions or comments that you have. Let me see here. Okay, so there was a question. Are we talking about smudging or with fresh sage? I'm not sure I really understand the question, but you can use dried sage also. So what we will do in the summertime is we will go out and we will harvest sage according to our cultural beliefs and with respect to the life of the sage and the spirit of the sage, and we will gather it and we will dry it, and we will use that for smudging throughout the year. Okay, is there any other questions or comments? Not seeing any. Thank you, Chris, for the appreciation, for a beautiful presentation. I really appreciate your comments and your feedback, And I know that this is particular and specific to the Lakota culture, but I really believe that all indigenous tribes, indigenous peoples have cultural lifeways that can be brought to the forefront for healing and responding to trauma.
So it
If
seems
there
like
are
Julie,
no,
uh, sorry, it just seems like Julie was meaning in the purification ceremony when she
oh,
was
okay,
talking about smudging or fresh sage.
okay. So in the purification ceremony, when the Wopaki did the purification of the spirit ceremony from purification from trauma is done, then they can use fresh sage, or they can use, if it's in the wintertime and there's no fresh sage, then they can use the dried sage. You're welcome, Julie. If there are no other questions or comments, Wopilas Kanka Echichape, which in our language means thank you very much. I honor the work that all of you are doing, the sacrifices that you make on behalf of our people. Thank you. And even though I can't see you, then I will remember all of you in prayer. And as we go through this public health crisis, I acknowledge the struggles that people are having, the relatives that are have the illness, and the families of those that have the illness. And I just like to encourage all of us to remember each other in prayer. Okay,
So
I
actually we
have a
have,
question. Okay.
yeah.
What term can I use for my son who does have complex needs when communicating with the schools about his needs? I think one of the, in the Lakota language, we have a term that's called wapchet hokecha, which means a different way. It's not about judging them. It's not about, using terminology like, again, like special ed kid, or, passive aggressive, or, all of those terms, those mental health terms that we use. It's about understanding that they have a different way of responding or approaching things that may have been formed by, their experiences, whether they're positive or negative. And just because somebody does have, the complex needs, it doesn't mean that, they've been through trauma. It might mean something totally different. It might mean that they have a gift, from the Creator that is, that they're here for, a specific reason that we don't understand. So I think being very, advocating for your son in terms of, his needs, and not calling them problems, and really advocating with the school to use the terminology and to change their terminology also, and their approach. So thank you for that question. Hopefully that was helpful. And Linda's saying you might just say my son. And I agree with that. Thank you for that, Chepmashi, Linda. A lot of times, we tend to try to label everything, and very simple, my son, very loving. Thank you for that. Okay, we are about 5 minutes to the hour, and I don't see any other questions or comments. And again, I thank you for participating today, and appreciate all of you taking the time. And if there's any questions or comments after the presentation, then Red Wind Consulting does know how to get in touch with me, and I'd be glad to respond. Thank you very much.
All right. Before we end our presentation, I would just like to remind everyone about our upcoming webinars. So, coming up on May 18th, we have Sexual Violence Against Native Boys and Men, which will be presented by Lenny Hayes. and once again, that's on May 18th. After that, on June 22nd, we have Building Cultural and Traditional Services into Schools, which will be presented by the wonderful Ethleen. And both of those will be at the same time at 1 p.m. Mountain Time and 2 p.m. Central Time. And with that said, I would like to thank Ethleen, our presenter. I'd like to thank Stephanie, the TATA host, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope you all stay safe.
Thank you very much.